Many of us are caring for a loved one with cognitive decline, memory loss, or Alzheimer's. Or we're concerned about staying sharp ourselves. On today's episode, I talk with Rachel Hostetler, a neuroscientist at the Allen Institute in Seattle, about exciting developments in brain research and what science can tell us about the aging brain. Here's my conversation with Rachel. Hi, Rachel. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So, Rachel, tell me what inspired you to be a brain scientist, or should I say neuroscientist?
Yeah, brain science, neuroscience, it both works. I think, in high school, I was always interested actually in a lot of different subjects. In college, I actually double majored in neuroscience and German, and I knew other people who had, varied interests. But then I decided to keep on the neuroscience path. I enjoyed my classes a lot, learning about all the different things that our brain does every day that we don't realize that we might, take for granted, just seeing the world and navigating the world. These are all very complex things for the brain to do. So I decided to continue my education and go for a PhD in neuroscience, which I finished in 2023. And there I did a lot of research characterizing different types of neurons in the brain and their connections. And then now I work at the Allen Institute, where I get to work with very large brain data sets and share that data with other scientists around the world.
Well, tell me about the Allen Institute. We know that it holds a unique place not only here in Washington State, but in fact around the world.
Yeah, so the Allen Institute is an independent bioscience research center. And so what's really unique about the Allen Institute is the types of projects that they take on. So they take on these very large-scale projects that are almost impossible for a smaller academic lab to do, right? You need hundreds of people, a lot of manpower, a lot of machinery to do these types of experiments. And this type of work is really influential for the rest of the world. When I was in graduate school doing my research, I relied on a lot of data sets and tools that were produced by the Allen Institute, because they share all their data freely for other scientists to use all around the world.
And it's really about basic science, is that correct? And for folks who don't really understand what basic science means, can you tell us what basic science is?
Yeah, so biomedical research can really be split into clinical, translational, and basic research. And I think many people are familiar with clinical research. They've heard of clinical trials, right? If there's a new drug being developed, you need to test it, see how well it works. But before that, there's the translational research, which is figuring out, usually in some type of animal, how does this disease work? How did the drugs work? And then before that, you need to first know the basic science, which is what even happens to the cells in certain diseases? How does this disease affect the body? Really the foundational information of just what's happening in general. What's the context? And so you need that basic research of just figuring out how many cell types do we even have in the brain, in a healthy brain, before you can really dive into other things like certain diseases and, other different scenarios, right? Because you need a baseline to sort of compare everything to. So basic science is really looking at that foundational science and figuring out, uncovering the unknown unknowns about the brain and sort of turning them into like known unknowns, right? So there's things that we don't know. But if we do enough research, does that make, okay, I don't know if I'm rambling, but.
So there are a lot of unknowns, and it's really about the building blocks, right?
Yes.
That's what we're getting at, is that basic research is, if we don't have a good understanding of the building blocks, it's hard to understand anything else.
Exactly.
Sound about right? So what do we hope to learn about the brain, and why is that information, I think, useful? We talked a little bit about the building blocks, but it's a big mystery still, isn't it?
It is. And the types of information and data that we have now in the last 5-10 years, we couldn't get that information, a decade, 2 decades ago, because the technology in machines didn't exist. So there's really been this explosion of new types of experiments and new types of data Yeah, really in the last 5 to 10 years that are giving us a new understanding of the brain. So we knew over 100 years ago that different parts of the brain do different things. And we could usually figure this out after like a brain injury, right? You injure a part of the brain, maybe you lose your ability to see or to walk, and you can sort of piece together what brain areas do what. And then the next step is now figuring out, the billions of cells that are in those different brain areas. What are they doing? How do they connect to each other and to other parts of the brain? So really looking at that very detailed cellular level. That's what we're figuring out now, is what's going on at the most detailed level of the brain.
So the analogy of building blocks, or the other important thing I think to think about as we think about the brain, right? We know that the heart keeps oxygen flowing through all of our body, but the brain is like the computer that runs everything, correct?
Yes, and even basic things you don't realize, like your depth perception and how you navigate the world, and how you walk in a building and you remember the pathway that you walk back out, or listening to someone and tuning out the background noise of the traffic, right? These are all things that your brain is constantly doing, and you might not fully realize that until maybe you lose that ability, either through an illness, or an injury. So there's a lot of complex things happening all the time that, if you were constantly aware of it, that'd be overwhelming. So it's a good thing that we're not aware of it.
Right. One of the things that we often hear is that people are not wired the same. We hear that phrase. Is that true?
Yeah, I think we're still figuring out what exactly the standard, wiring diagram is. That's to get it at the actual level to see everything takes many, many years and a lot of data. So I think we're still trying to figure out exactly what that means. And I think especially when looking at human brains in particular, it's important to know that there's really no normal. Like if you were to, have exclusion criteria for certain things for a study, eventually you would eliminate everyone, right? I'm sure you could look at anyone's brain anywhere, and there's something in there that's maybe slightly, not considered, maybe standard or something. There's something going on in everyone's brains. That's a little different, but we don't fully know the layout of everyone's brains yet, so it's a little tricky.
Okay, so just like a computer, you have all the different elements, but you could wire it differently, and some things might be a little bit different, which is why we have differences in computers. Maybe? Is that a good analogy?
Yeah, I mean, even, from day to day, your brain can also, change itself, right? Like every time you learn a new skill or learn, you have a new memory, that there's a physical change in your brain that's also representative of that. I know some people maybe have heard of the term, neuroplasticity, and there's a lot of examples of that where, especially in terms of injury or illness, right? If you have an injury somewhere in the brain, or maybe you lose your eyesight, other areas can shift and take over. But also, like if you're learning, how to throw a basketball or something, that's muscle memory, which also involves the brain. So every time you do something like that, you are rewiring your brain a little bit.
So one of the things that I've heard that the Allen Institute is most famous for, and I actually do remember when the news article came out that said the Allen Institute has created a map of the brain. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so these brain atlases are hugely important for the neuroscience community. I previously mentioned that I relied on some of these atlases during my own graduate work because they just contain so much data that's useful for everyone around the world to use, to help design their experiments and to help, do research in their own lab. And the goal of these atlases, currently we're focusing more on cellular atlases. So we're trying to map out all of the individual cells in the brain. And so it's kind of like if you have an atlas of the United States, right? You have all your different states, which is sort of like our big brain areas. But then within each state, you have all these different towns and different roadways and pathways and connections between states. And that's what we're trying to map out with these atlases, is all that detailed information and the connections between different areas. And these atlases are put online for other scientists to use. And I get to travel for research conferences and actually meet with, neuroscientists from all over the world who are very appreciative of these data sets. And it's made a huge impact on their work. And I also understand because I also used it, in my graduate work. So it's really creating this foundation for the rest of the neuroscience community to use and to help answer, their own research questions.
So my understanding is that the Allen Institute has taken on the project of developing an Alzheimer's disease atlas. Can you tell us more about that and what you've learned?
Yeah, so this project is really special because we're looking at all the different cell types in a particular area of the brain, but in the context of Alzheimer's disease. And this is a sort of a unique way to view Alzheimer's disease, right? A lot of people think of the plaques that occur in the brain and studying, the different proteins. But here we're looking at what's happening to the neurons. Are they getting sick? Why are they getting sick? And what was really unique about this study from the Allen Institute is that there wasn't a focus just on the really severe Alzheimer's. There was actually samples from donors who spanned the severity, the spectrum of disease. So people who had low levels of pathology, high levels in their brain, lots of dementia, no dementia. And so by collecting, a variety of disease, we could actually see that, not all brain cells are lost, at one time in Alzheimer's. You could actually map out throughout the progression of disease which neurons or which cells are affected in the beginning, which are affected later on. And so this was really the first time that we could see this progression of the disease. And so this is interesting for a number of reasons. One is that, that first neuron that gets sick in the very beginning, is that like the first domino that then causes a cascade and causes all these other brain cells to get sick? We don't know. That's a question that we can now investigate and figure out, if you come up with a treatment that targets just that first type of early neuron that gets sick, what will that do for the rest of disease?
So is it that the neurons are changing so that you have sick cells that at some point is the hope that we can turn those into healthy cells again? Or is it that there's a predominance of sick cells, that's hard to say,
Yeah.
sick cells that take over?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think figuring out, first off, why this particular group, because it was a very specific group within a group, this very isolated group that was getting sick first, these types of neurons, and figuring out, why are they getting sick? That's still unknown. But I think these particular types of neurons, they have a specific role in that they are sort of the brake to the brain. So you have two different types of neurons in the brain that are like the accelerator, so they make neurons fire. And then you also have a brake, which are inhibitory neurons. And so this is a really important balance, because if you have constant neurons with lots of electrical activity all the time, that happens in some seizure disorders. If you have too much neurons that are braking too much, right, that's also not good.
So braking as in stop.
Stop, exactly.
Right, versus, yeah.
So our stop and go, that'd be
stop
another
and
way.
Go. There we go.
Our stop and our go neurons. And these particular ones that were getting sick were some of these stop neurons. And so one thought is, maybe that's causing too much electricity in other areas. Maybe that's what's causing this shift and balance, and maybe causing the other neurons to get sick. So that's sort of the next step, is trying to uncover all of that.
That's really interesting. That's super, super interesting. So we're here at ARP, and as you know, our mission at ARP is to serve those who are 50 and older. Can you tell us a little bit what happens to the brain as we age? Do cells continue to regenerate? Do they change over time? Do they die off? What happens to the brain as we age?
Yeah, so in the general brain, no disease, a healthy brain, you do have neurons that die off. That is a just standard part of aging. That's natural. That's not indicative of any disease. That's just part of the aging process. So you do have.
And just again, let me pause you here for a second. Will you tell us again what neurons do?
Oh, yes. So neurons are the cells in the brain that send electrical signals. So they're the ones that communicate to each other. And you have other types of cells in the brain, support cells to help support the neurons. But the neurons they do a lot of the electrical work in the brain. And so you do lose some of them as you age, which is normal. And the brain also does shrink a little bit as you age, which, again, is also normal. That's considered a little bit is normal with aging. And you do have some changes in the energy levels of certain cells. But what we're looking at now at the Allen Institute is looking at, are all cells affected equally, or are there certain, neurons or maybe support cells that are affected more or less? Mm-hmm. And so a project came out earlier this year from the Allen Institute looking in the mouse brain, how certain cells or neurons change over time. And we have a lot of very similar neurons and cells compared to mouse. So it's useful to study them, and we can learn a lot about ourselves by looking at their brains. But a study came out a couple months ago showing that, I just mentioned you have some cells die. So you would think, okay, all cells are maybe dying. But no, it turns out there are certain cells, immune cells in your brain that actually, their genes are more active with aging, And why is this happening?
Is that in a protective manner?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, some of them are having more activity, potentially more inflammation. And this can be considered in the normal, healthy aging brain. So these are just some changes that we see, over time.
So not all bad. Could be also for some good. Yes?
Yeah, it's hard to figure out, what exactly. I mean, again, this is talking about a study from mouse. So
okay.
We can only look at, we can only say so many definitive things, about human. But we can notice that, certain cells die off and, and this is not the only time in life that we have neurons die off in the brain. There's actually a period of time in adolescence where you may have heard, if you learn a skill as a child, it's easier than learning as an adult. And there is some truth behind that. You do, throughout adolescence, lose a lot of connections in your brain and certain brain cells. And that's on purpose because your brain's becoming more efficient. And so you might think it's a bad thing to lose certain connections or cells, but, and sometimes throughout life, that's actually a good thing.
Well, I think one of the big discoveries that has actually led to some of the work that we do, right, is about understanding that brain development continues certainly beyond the age of 18 or even 21, but we think about brain development now until our mid-20s. Mm-hmm. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. There's a lot of changes that happen throughout time, both with the neurons and also with, those support cells. And so, your brain is definitely not set in stone.
It's not static, in other words. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about, for many ARP members and for older adults, having a healthy brain is super important because obviously if it helps us in our functioning, in our reactions, and just makes up who we are, lots of folks are really interested in understanding how to take care of their brain. And one of the things we've heard is the impact of music. Can you talk a little bit about how music fires off neurons in the brain, or is that what happens? Or
yeah, so music is interesting because it involves many parts of your brain. So if it's, a song you have a very emotional connection to or memories, those are different parts of the brain, but you're also hearing it. So that's the auditory part of the brain. Maybe you're also dancing to it. That's the motor part of the brain. So it's really an experience that involves lots of different areas. And I think that's apparent when, maybe you've seen some of these examples online, if someone, had a brain injury or maybe has dementia, and then they hear their favorite song and they instantly change, their personality, right? And I think that's just a very strong example of how important music can be and how it's really stored and, affects different parts of your brain.
Actually, listening to what you've said, it makes me think that there are multiple reasons why music is really important, whether it's lifting your mood or actually getting you to move and exercise or dance.
Yeah, and I think another important thing is social connection. Something that I've read about a lot in terms of, keeping your brain healthy with aging is social connection. And, having friendships. And, I think music is also a big part of that. Having a community of people, maybe you like the same music, you go to shows. I think those are other good examples.
But part of the social isolate, so going back to the science of the brain, right, though, is the reduction of stress from social isolation. Is that
I think
the link you would make?
Yeah, I think, anything that reduces stress is definitely helpful. Yeah, social connection brings out a lot of positive benefits that people might, you might take for granted, initially, and you don't fully realize it. But I think there's, a lot of benefits of just sharing, your day with someone, having connections with people. But also, remembering to keep your brain active, right? If you like to have, debates or, more, fun conversations with some people, that's also a good way to keep your brain sharp. Yeah.
So going back to the brain, and one of the things I think that the work of the brain mapping has done, if I'm correct, is that you've been able to identify different parts of the brain monitor or are in charge of different functions, right? So whether it's our feeling, our memory, the basic function of our bodies, is that correct?
Yes.
So brain games. Are brain games good for us, and is that helping to exercise a critical part of our brain?
Yeah, I've read a little bit about the brain games. I don't know if I've personally played any of these. Well, crossword puzzles, maybe if those count.
I play Mahjong.
There we go.
I like
Sudoku, I played some of that.
I like Wordle.
Those are, I think that falls into the same category of really doing anything to make your brain, struggle a little bit, whether that's like learning a new language or, reading, a book or learning new skills. I think all of these things are very important. And I've read that they're very important, over time, just to keep your brain active. And I mean, there's a famous saying in neuroscience that dates back, I think, to like the 1940s. It's basically neurons that wire together, fire together. That's also like use it or lose it, basically.
Neurons that fire together,
wire together.
Wire together. Love it.
So if you repeat, certain things, it does, physically, things get stronger or weaker in the brain, the more you do things.
That's great. So again, thinking about the brain as a muscle that even as you age, you have to continue to exercise.
Yeah, and I think, any brain exercises you can think of, I've read that those are very beneficial, but also physical exercise, as well. I think that also, from what I've read, also very important, for brain health, staying active, moving around, and, especially if you're moving around, going on a walk with a friend or something, right? Because then you can combine two things. You can combine social interaction and movement. So or dancing to music,
It's great. Tell me what you're most excited about in terms of brain research and the direction it's heading.
Yeah, I think just the amount of data and information that we're getting each year is truly remarkable. If you look back at some of these, smaller cell atlases, one was made by the Allen Institute in 2016, and it had 1,600 cells. And that was very exciting, and very important, in 2016. And then then 2 years ago in 2023, a new atlas was released with 8 million cells. So, and it covered the entire brain of the mouse. And so this is just really important because this shows, why was this possible? Well, there were new technologies that were developed, new protocols, things became more efficient. And so, first you have to prove something on a smaller area, smaller scale, and then you can start to scale up. And so now, the human brain is quite large. So that's another thing that's being scaled up to now. Is another study came out in 2023 looking at the first version of a human brain cell atlas. And that contained also millions of cells and was very exciting. And that work's not done. It's also not set in stone. There's current projects going on now at the Institute to expand upon that work. And so I think there's this continuous progression, that goes along with developments in technology and new experiments and new techniques where you get new types of data and new types of information that you couldn't get before. So it's really just this very large explosion. And what's really exciting about, creating these very large atlases and data sets and then putting them online freely for anyone to use is that, there could be someone on the other side of the world making very important discoveries with that data, right? There could be many people around the world also doing that. So it's really creating this guidebook for other neuroscientists to use. And, whatever questions they ask, whatever specific areas they're looking at, it's very important. And they'll find detailed, information and make new insights that we didn't make. So I think that's very exciting.
I think my comment around that is the appreciation for open science or open data, and knowing that I think what you've said is that the brain is so complex with these millions of cells that it allows us, that it's going to take a lot of scientists working together. But let's go back to help us understand a little bit more about the importance of brain science, which is getting to translational research, which you've talked about, which is sort of developing drugs or developing an understanding of how the brain works so that we can work towards, and this is obviously from a very humanistic approach or focus on humans, wanting to take care of our brains.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. So I think, the Alzheimer's project at the Institute, because most of the work at the Institute is not disease focused. It's just figuring out the foundation, building blocks of the brain, and then, which is very important to do that first. And then there was actually a little, mini atlas created from healthy brain tissue. And that was used as the basis for the Alzheimer's study, because then they had samples from Alzheimer's and then compared it to that previous study they had from the healthy tissue. And then they could see, oh, these cells changed with disease, or these ones, are different. And so figuring out that foundation first is you need some sort of baseline, right, to compare things to. And I think especially with, Alzheimer's, we're learning so much more about the disease now. I know we've been studying it for a number of decades, but with the new techniques and the new detail and precision that we can see, individual cells changing in certain ways, I think that'll be really helpful for coming up with new treatments.
So I have to even get out of my own head to understand and think that what you're really doing around brain science and all of this research is investigating why we are who we are. Is that right in some ways?
A little bit. I think just figuring out, what's even there, right? Like if you break a bone and you go to the doctor, there's a name for the bone. They're like, oh, you broke your tibia, you broke this, right? And we still don't have names for all of the different cells in the brain, right? So that's a huge thing. It's just figuring that out and creating some type of common language that neuroscientists can agree upon for saying, this neuron has this name, it has this function, because that's still very much up for debate in the neuroscience field. If you're studying something, you get to name it whatever you want. Someone else around the world is maybe also studying that same neuron, but they give it a different name. And then, comparing the actual genetic data, you can see, oh, wait, that's the same neuron. So that's another big thing that these atlases are trying to do, coming up with a common name and language for a lot of these cell types so that we're all on the same page and we can see where, scientists agree and disagree.
Are there changes in how the brain is wired due to aging?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we're still trying to figure that out and figuring out what those changes would be. And the research done at the Allen Institute, first we're looking at, the individual cells and sort of identifying them in our big atlases. And then the next step is then looking at the connections between these different neurons or different cells. Because a neuron can make a connection with hundreds or sometimes thousands of other neurons. So mapping out all those different connections is quite I don't know how to say this. It's quite the task. The Allen Institute just released a very large connectome, which is basically a map of all the different neurons and all their connections in part of a mouse brain. And it was, a cubic millimeter. And that took, I think, 7 or 8 years, mapping out all the details of that level of precision. So figuring out, the exact wiring diagram of the brain is still very much in progress.
Rachel, thanks for coming. It's been great to learn a little bit about the brain, and I look forward to learning more about the brain.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation.